Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Today we start another subsection of Hebrews that covers chapters 8, 9, and well into 10. It covers the high priestly ministry of Christ. The author of Hebrews to this point has established that Jesus Christ is the Son, the King, and High Priest in his storyline. But it clearly is the high priest title and role that is most prominent in the Hebrews version of the gospel, taught Dr. Fred Craddock at Emory University. He has also made it clear that Jesus was not a priest or high priest while on earth. Yet his self-sacrifice on the cross is to be understood in a high priest atonement role, is the message to the Hebrews, the audience that he is trying to pass on. That is, he gave himself rather than the blood of a goat at the atonement for human sins. This story flow will be drawn out over the next 3 chapters and is essentially the heart of the Christology being proposed in Hebrews. It will take us several sessions to go through this. We'll start by reading the first 6 verses of chapter 8 in Hebrews in the New Revised Standard. Now the main point in what we are saying is this. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the sanctuary and the true tent, that the Lord and not any mortal has set up. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They offer worship in a sanctuary that is a sketch and shadow of the heavenly one. For Moses, when he was about to erect the tent, was warned, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But Jesus has now obtained a more excellent ministry, and to that degree he is the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through a better promise. Dr. Eugene Boring and Dr. Fred Craddock opened their New Testament commentary on these 6 verses with the comment that the image of a heavenly throne was deeply embedded in Judaism of the late BC and early AD periods, especially used in the apocalyptic literature of the period, as we see also in the Dead Sea Scrolls community's writings. It is also found in the New Testament in John's apocalyptic story, which we know is the book of Revelation. But even much earlier, we find some references to it in Daniel, Isaiah, and Ezekiel's writings of the Old Testament. Scholars do not miss the context in verse 1 there of chapter 8. Christ is seated at God's right hand. That means he has a seat in heaven. That establishes the location of his ministry as high priest. So Hebrews is not about Jesus' earthly ministry, as essentially the synoptic gospels are, but to Christ's ministry in heaven. Dr. Peter T. O'Brien, as an Anglican scholar, teaches that the one who sat down at the right hand of God in heaven was considered to be the ultimate high priest in Judaism. That was their theological tenet, especially in this late BC, early AD period. Thus, Christ's high priest role in heaven, is in heaven, not here on earth. He was never a high priest on earth. He has entered and now serves from the ultimate and true inner sanctuary that is in heaven. The Holy of Holies in the earthly tabernacle, used by the Levitical priesthood on earth, was a shadow or image of that true Holy of Holies where Christ sits in heaven, is the theology here. Scholars of Middle Eastern antiquities add here that the earthly temples were constructed in nearly all the religions to some sort of heavenly pattern was assumed. That's a very ancient Semitic idea pre-exceeding Abraham and Moses. Earthly temples were to be replicas of the true temples in heaven and in the Greek literature in the cosmos. Thus, scholars say a key point is being made here, that it was understood to be that way at the time that Moses was writing, that Moses instructed his rules, that Moses was, in fact, obeying God's instruction when he set up one on earth, and that these instructions are consistent with a long-standing Semitic thought process. So in no way is this a general indictment, or to be construed as a general indictment or criticism of the earthly tabernacle by this author, several scholars point out. Instead, the point here is that there has been a paradigm shift. The earthly one has served its purpose in time. It's now time to recognize that things have changed. The earthly one was temporary and had a limited role and a limited time. Also, the one in heaven will serve all people and not be limited just to the Israelites and Jews, as was the one on earth. Dr. Harold Attridge, writing from Notre Dame University at the time, says, "Do not miss the shift to the word ministry that occurred in verse 2. As we read it in the New Revised Standard Version, but that word ministry doesn't appear there in many translations." He says, however, and he's a Greek scholar, that is the correct translation from the Greek and was so used widely in Jewish literature as well at the time. It was the word used for describing priestly duties in Greek terms. Attridge says the Hebrew author is here shifting to the priestly duties of Christ and using it to describe from where the duties, ministry if you will, are originating. They're originating from a heavenly tabernacle, the true tabernacle, not the Herod temple there on earth. Dr. O'Brien added, "We need to appreciate that the high priest in Judaism of the time was considered to be a minister of God's sanctuary here on earth. His ministry was to emerge from that sanctuary, that is, from the temple. Thus, what is inferred here is that God's ministry is now coming from the new high priest who is sitting in heaven and not sitting in Herod's temple in Jerusalem." Such would have been a heavy point of conflict for a Hebrew community of that day and time. As many scholars say, it is still a significant point of conflict in dealing with this issue relative to where the tabernacle is located and that sort of thing in ministry today. One of the ideas that's left by some of the scholars is this: wake up is the idea here. He has changed the location of his ministry. That is, God has. And at the process, it's coming from his heavenly throne room, that true temple, and not the temple there in Jerusalem. In verse 3, the theme shifts to the general duties of the priest. a priest is installed to offer gifts and sacrifices to God, was the general understanding at the time of what a priest would be doing. Therefore, he is asking, does not Christ have something to offer? By deduction, scholars say, Jesus had nothing to offer based on the standards that are there in Judaism at the time, by the earthly standards. So by normally earthly standards, he had nothing that they normally would consider a priest to be offering. But what the earthly priest did met the law of Moses, that was only a sketch and shadow of the real thing. Of course, this author knows already from what, or his audience knows already from what this author had said, that he is speaking Christ now fulfilling the role of high priest, and that Christ offered himself as a human sacrifice rather than the normal sacrifice that was offered on the Day of Atonement for human sins, which was a goat offering or a young bullock. But Hebrews does not remind us of that here. That is the text itself. But notice where he did go. He places what Jesus had to give in a negative light under earthly standards. Interesting approach. That is, under the Mosaic law, what Jesus did doesn't make sense. Thus concluding, Jesus' self-sacrifice would not have been sufficient to satisfy anything under the law, while that the earthly priest offers a goat or a bull does. So the idea is you cannot use the Mosaic law to interpret what's going on here. You have to have a new paradigm. They were doing what God set up for the time and place, but that was only a sketch and shadow of the real thing. Jesus did the correct thing at the correct time, but had it been done at some other time, it may not have met that standard. Thus, what Jesus was doing is not to be viewed as wrong, as some want to say, said Fred Craddock. Another modern scholar says, in modern limbo, he says, God has moved the cheese, and we need to understand that that's the direction things are going. The final point made by several scholars for this section is that Christ's ministry is more excellent and or superior to the previous because it mediates a better covenant and comes and enacts a better promise for the humans. That's one of the key points that will be addressed as we go further. I hope this gives you some help on how scholars interpret those first 6 verses as we open up these new 3 chapters in Hebrews. Have a good week.